At dawn, 150 years ago, an army of British, French and Turkish soldiers landed on Russia's southern shore.
By 12 o'clock, that barren and desolate beach, inhabited by wildfowl only a short time before, was swarming with life. We are an army of occupation at last.
Soon that desolate terrain would be teeming with corpses. 1 million soldiers and civilians dead by the end of the war.
Today we count 160 dead of the 600 men of our regiment who landed a month ago. Our splendid band is quite silenced. The big drummer has been killed by a round shot. The first clarinet is dead of cholera. And the poor child who played the cymbals has lost a leg.
"50 years later, one of Russia's first filmmakers put these old survivors on parade once more. Russian, British and French veterans of the Crimean War stared uncertainly into the 20th century. They'd fought in a war which straddles the frontier between myth and the modern world. These are the men who fought at Inkerman, Alma and Balaclava. These are the men who charged into the Valley of Death and into the legends of war.
Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode, and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600.
But on the front line where the poets didn't go were the first war photographers and war correspondents. This story of the Crimean War is told by the diaries and letters, the paintings and photographs of those who were actually there. The accounts they left make this war unique. Never before had the British public heard so clearly what glorious war was really like.
A large number of sick and, I fear, dying men were sent into Balaclava today. They formed one of the most ghastly processions that ever poet imagined, with closed eyes, open mouths, and ghastly attenuated breath visible in the frosty air alone showing they were still alive. As the apparitions passed, the only remarks the soldiers made were such as these. "There's one poor fellow out of pain anyway."
They had died in a war which changed the map of Europe forever. What ignited the war was the decay of the mighty Ottoman Empire, which had carried Islamic rule into the heart of Europe. To the north, Imperial Russia waited like a vulture, eyeing its prey. In January 1853, the British ambassador visited the Tsar in St. Petersburg to discover his intentions towards Turkey. The Tsar's reply sounded like an invitation to conspire.
"We have a sick man on our hands, a man who is seriously ill. The sick man is dying. We must come to some understanding."
But Tsar Nicholas did not come to an understanding with the British. Nine months later, Russian troops crossed the Danube into Turkey's European provinces. The Tsar's pretext was the protection of Orthodox Christians living under Islamic rule. His gamble was that no Christian power would ever fight to protect a Muslim state. France and Britain suspected the real Russian target was Constantinople. The city commanded the strategic gateway from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. If Russia seized control, her warships would have access to the open seas all the year round. Finally, in November 1853, a confrontation at Sinop on the southern shore of the Black Sea propelled Britain and France towards war. A Russian fleet spotted a Turkish squadron sheltering in port from bad weather. The Russian Admiral Nakhimov launched an attack using a devastating new weapon: explosive shells.
In an hour and a half, the action was decided. And if Admiral Nakhimov had ceased his fire, there would have been no stain on his credit. But he kept up a merciless fire of shot and shell which killed numbers of unresisting men. He did not cease firing till every Turkish ship save one was a stranded wreck. Adolphus Slade.
Admiral Slade was a British officer serving with the Ottoman Navy. His report of the massacre was rushed back to London.
The shore of the bay was littered with wrecks and strewn with corpses. Havoc had done her worst. Not a mast was standing, not a timber was left whole. We found above 100 wounded in every stage of suffering, some in agony, many of them disfigured by explosions.
The exploding shells at Sinop sent a warning to all the wooden warships of Europe. It was a victory which Britain, the leading naval power, could not ignore.
It is a major triumph for the Russians, who destroy the Ottoman fleet at virtually no loss to themselves. In political terms, it isn't so much of a triumph, because it plays into the hands of the war party, particularly in London, and it does bring the British and the French fleets into the Black Sea.
The Russian warships had sailed from Sebastopol, headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. From this moment, Britain's naval chiefs started to make plans for attacking Sebastopol and destroying Russia's naval power.
For the British, Sinop was a national humiliation. Britannia's rule over the waves had been called into question by the Russians, the Turkish fleet had been destroyed, and the popular press termed it a massacre.
In France, too, the call to war was sounded. Earlier that year, Napoleon III had proclaimed himself emperor. His ambition was to match the military glory of his uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte. The British commander-in-chief was Lord Raglan. His right arm had been shot away at the Battle of Waterloo, and he still referred to France as the enemy. The French and British now buried centuries of rivalry and formed an alliance. In March 1854, they declared war on Russia. From Glasgow, Birmingham and Norwich, young men were in a hurry to enlist and see some action. Timothy Gowing was one of the first.
I was fast approaching my 20th year, a dangerous age to many, and thrilling accounts of war in the newspapers worked me up to try my luck. In marching out of the barracks at Manchester, we could have walked over the heads of the people, who were wrought up to such a pitch of excitement as almost amounted to madness.
Cheer, boys, cheer, no more a vital song.
And then the band struck up, Cheer, Boys, Cheer, which seemed to have a thrilling effect on the multitude and gave fresh animation to the men.
Tomorrow, let's forget the darkness of today.
The British army headed for Constantinople to join their French and Turkish allies. This was the city they had come to defend, the crumbling capital of Turkey's Islamic Empire. Fanny Jubilee, the 24-year-old wife of a cavalry officer, was one of several women who accompanied their husbands to war.
Turkish dogs, lazy and dirty, were lying about in all directions, while horrible, filthy beggars were hovering everywhere. The little harbour is filled with refuse of every description. I was never more completely disillusioned in my life than with my first day in Constantinople.
As French and British troops strolled around the unfamiliar streets, it began to dawn on them what a strange venture they had embarked on.
We had nothing particular to note, except that we were going out to defend a rotten cause, a race that almost every Christian despises. The Turks struck me as a queer lot, particularly the women, who did not seem to put themselves out in the least, but were dirty and lazy looking. Private Timothy Gowing.
The British and the French armies treated their Turkish allies with a quite remarkable degree of racial arrogance. It's noticeable that they commandeered most of the major buildings in the capital, most of the major barracks, most of the major military hospitals. The Turks had to make do and mend with whatever they could scrounge in their own capital.
The biggest building commandeered by the British was the huge barracks at Scutari. This was where Florence Nightingale would lead her team of nurses and create the legend of the Lady with the Lamp. But Fanny Jubilee was not impressed by the facilities.
The barracks appeared from the outside to be a very fine building, but the inside, the dilapidation, the dirt, the rats, the fleas, these last are really so terrible that several officers have been fairly routed by them and are obliged either to pitch their tents on the common or to sleep on board the ships.
While the Allied fleet anchored off Constantinople and awaited their orders, another armada set sail from Britain. In March 1854, the photographer Roger Fenton stood on the shore of Portsmouth Harbour and took this photograph of a British fleet heading for the Baltic, commanded by Admiral Sir Charles Napier. The ocean was Britain's most important battlefield, and the Royal Navy was confident they could teach the Tsar a lesson, that no part of Russia's huge coastline was beyond her guns. These sailors would demonstrate Britain's naval superiority by sailing right up to the Tsar's palace. The fleet passed through the Baltic and reached the fortress of Kronstadt, which protected the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. They anchored in full view of the imperial palace, but Kronstadt was too well fortified. After a close look at the city's defences, the British fleet sailed off in search of an easier target. Napier now planned an all-out attack on the Tsar's Baltic stronghold of Bomasund, a group of fortresses bristling with guns. He had 10,000 French troops on board as military muscle. His warships were accompanied by several small boats, battlefield tourists, eager to see some action. The Reverend Robert Hughes, a fellow of Magdalen College, Cambridge, was in the front line with his brother when the attack began.
My brother was off soon after dawn and secured an excellent position among the French sharpshooters, where he got a capital view of everything. I followed soon after and quickly came into view of the fort, which was blazing away pretty briskly. The brightest colours flew in the merry breeze, which was blowing stinking smoke and burnt gunpowder into the eyes of our unhappy foes. This was turning war into a holiday, with a vengeance.
After 3 days of heavy bombardment, the Russians surrendered. A chastened Reverend Hughes entered the ruins to record the human cost of this victory.
We passed into a room which had a cold feeling about it. I looked round and saw the cold, clean, silent forms of the dead. The light linen cloths that shrouded the stiffened figures wavered and flickered in the draught, as if stirred by the breaths of those who could breathe no more. What did these poor fellows know about the Turkish question? And yet they had fought and trembled, they had writhed in agony, and now father and brother, maid and mother were weeping and breaking their hearts for them.
The forts of Bomersund were utterly destroyed, but because the Tsar's capital remained unscathed, the British public felt let down. The Illustrated London News wrote sarcastically of how the Baltic fleet with 50,000 men sailed up the seas and then sailed home again. In a series of battles along the Danube, the Russians found the sick man of Europe to be a much tougher opponent than they'd expected when they first crossed the river. The Ottoman army saw this as a jihad, a holy war against the Russian infidels. Leading them into battle was a renegade Christian from Croatia who'd adopted the Muslim faith and the name of Omar Pasha. In a letter to the Sultan, he sang the praises of his victorious army.
In this battle, many Russians were killed while our imperial army sustained 30 martyrs and 150 wounded. With the grace of God and the inspiration of the Prophet and the sacred power of the most glorious Sultan, this commencement of war gave great honor to the sublime state and to all the people of Islam.
These photographs of Omar Pasha and his men were taken by the world's first war photographer. Karol Zatmari was an artist based in Bucharest who taught himself the new science of photography. He took 200 photographs of the war on the Danube, of which only a handful survived. A faded but unique account of this conflict between Russia and Islam. On the front line, he photographed Turkish soldiers posing in their uniforms. Afterwards, he slipped away to photograph some of their camp followers in the back streets. To photograph the Russian army, Zatmari packed his darkroom into a wagon and travelled along the Danube. Under fire from Turkish artillery, he reached the Tsar's troops on the other side. For weeks, these Russian soldiers had been besieging the Turkish fort of Silistria, which stood in the way of their advance on Constantinople. Among them, a 26-year-old artillery officer was busily recording the war in letters and diaries. His name was Leo Tolstoy, and his experiences would contribute to his epic novel War and Peace. From his regimental camp, Tolstoy had a comfortable view of the action.
You could see the town, the fortress, and the little forts of Silistria as though on the palm of your hand. You could hear the cannon fire and the rifle shots, which continued night and day. And, with a field glass, You could make out the Turkish soldiers.
Down below, the ordinary soldiers died in skirmishes or under bombardment from the cannon. But for artillery officers like Tolstoy, it was a faraway spectacle, something to enjoy.
It's true, it's a funny sort of pleasure to see people killing each other. And yet, every morning and every evening, I would get up on my cart and spend hours at a time watching. The spectacle was truly beautiful, especially at night.
The top priority for the Allies was to relieve the siege of Silistria, so they embarked for Varna on the Black Sea coast. For Private Harry Blishen in the Rifle Brigade, the glamour of war was wearing thin.
We were drilled incessantly during this time to give the young generals an insight of what they would have to do in the field, and I'm sorry to say we lost several men through the effect. That is why the French have such an advantage over us. You'll never see an inexperienced young officer in their service.
Another man to see the difference was William Howard Russell, the most famous journalist of the war. Russell wrote for the Times of London, and his reports would do much to dispel any illusion that British was automatically best.
The French manage these things better than we do. Where is the English post office? No one knows. Where does the English general live? No one knows. Does anyone want to find General Canrobert? Ask the first Frenchman you meet, and he will tell you to go up the Corso, turn to the right by the end of the Rue l'Hôpital, and you will see the name of the general printed in large letters over the door of his quarters.
The French were much more prepared than the British, but there are very good reasons for that. One reason, probably the main reason, is that the French army was a permanent army with permanent services such as health, clothing, weapons, equipments. Don't forget that the French army had been at war in Algeria since 1830. They were, the soldiers and the officers, all of them were very much experienced on the ground.
On the Danube, the Russian High Command stepped up the pressure on the Turkish stronghold of Silistria before British and French reinforcements could arrive.
The period that precedes an engagement is the most unpleasant. It's the only moment when you have time to be afraid. Towards 3 o'clock, we were waiting to see the shower of rockets let off as the signal for an attack. All of a sudden, an aide-de-camp of the field marshal arrived with the order to cancel the attack and end the siege.
The entire Russian army felt betrayed. Austria had intervened and forced the Tsar's troops to abandon their advance into Turkey's European provinces. The gates of Silistria would remain closed to the Russian army.
I can say without fear of error that this news was received by us all, soldiers, officers, and generals, as a terrible misfortune.
The whole venture had been a fiasco for the Russians, who retreated back across the Danube. They had unleashed events they could not control, a war that would soon engulf their homeland. The Allied army of 60,000 men had not yet fired a single shot, but if any of them believed this war would be easy, they were in for a shock. In 2 months, 1 man in every 6 would be dead. It was now the height of summer. The water was contaminated, and the soldiers were living in cramped conditions which would quickly turn murderous. These watercolours are part of a visual diary kept by a talented officer in the Rifle Brigade. Captain Henry Clifford was 28 years old and came from an aristocratic Catholic family. In August, he reported the onset of the disease all soldiers dreaded.
The cholera came at a time when we were all low-spirited and disgusted with the tiresome life we are leading. So bad has it been with the French, the medical men say it is no use fighting it. Fine young men in perfect health are taken ill and die in 4 and 5 hours. I grieve very much for a young officer who came out here from England. He arrived on Tuesday, was taken ill on Wednesday morning, and buried that evening.
The indomitable Fanny Jubilee had also arrived with her husband, Henry.
We are encamped on the cholera-stricken grounds just vacated by the Heavy Brigade. Here and there, a heap of loose earth with a protruding hand or foot showed where local inhabitants had desecrated the dead and dug them up to possess themselves of the blankets in which they were buried.
As the cholera struck the army at Varna, it also spread to the sailors on the warships which were offshore. And as sailors died, they were sewn up in canvas bags which were weighted at the bottom and were thrown overboard. But as the bodies decomposed, they rose to the surface and were bobbing up and down as if they were looking at the live sailors still on board ship, which was extremely disconcerting for them.
The change in the physical appearance of everybody is most marked. All seem as if a dozen years of hard suffering had been added to their lives. The hospital tents present a ghastly spectacle of suffering beyond all relief by human aid. Our detachment have already begun what is likely to be their chief occupation, burying the dead. Frederick Robinson, Assistant Surgeon, Scots Fusilier Guards.
The British and French armies had been at war for 4 months. They had lost 10,000 men, but not a single shot had been fired at the enemy. Finally, the crucial order was given. They would embark for the Crimea to destroy Russia's Black Sea stronghold at Sebastopol. Captain Clifford finished off his watercolours.
1,000 pities our army did not go at Sebastopol on first leaving England, when in rude health and full of spirits and enthusiasm. All of these have vanished. We've been kept in idleness, with hundreds falling around us by cholera and fever, and everyone feels the greatest repugnance to activity of any kind. I hope I may be able to write in a few days and tell you Sebastopol is taken, but I doubt it.
So the Allied fleet set sail again, but without any clear idea of where they were going to land.
Raglan and the French second-in-command went in Raglan's steam yacht and sailed up and down the coast looking for a suitable place to land. They actually sailed quite close to Sevastopol, close enough so that they could make out officers and men on the forts at Sevastopol. And as the ship sailed by, Raglan and his comrades raised their hats to the Russians on land, which was a courtesy which certainly wouldn't have been repeated in any war since.
After exchanging courtesies, the Allied fleet sailed north along the coast. Eventually, Raglan sighted a wide bay with the ominous name of Calamita and gave the order to disembark. At dawn on the 14th of September 1854, this barren shoreline was suddenly crowded with men, including the Times war correspondent, William Howard Russell.
From one extremity to the other, bayonets glistened and red coats glinted. The air was filled with our English speech, and the hum of voices mingled with the loud notes of command, the familiar address of Bill to Tom or Pat to Sandy, and an occasional shout of laughter.
But the excitement of landing in the Crimea could not conceal the usual bad planning.
Amid a gathering of doctors on the beach, I spied my friend Alexander, who was very angry. "Do make a note of this," he said. "They have landed this army without any kind of hospital transport or carts or anything. With all this cholera and diarrhea about, there are no means of taking the sick down to the boats."
Nevertheless, the Russians were impressed.
The whole of their light fleet was anchored within Calamita Bay, and at night their forest of masts was illuminated with various colored lanterns. The soldiers said, "Behold, the infidel has built another holy Moscow on the waves," comparing the masts of the ships to the church spires of that city. Captain Hodasevich, Tarutin Regiment.
The next day, the Russians saw some 60,000 men stretched over the plain below. Just 5 days after landing, the Allied commanders decided they were ready to march on Sebastopol and finish the war.
Cheer, boys, cheer, no more vital sorrow. Courage to hearts shall bear us on our way. Hope points before and shows a bright tomorrow. Let's forget the darkness of today. So farewell, England, so much as we may love you. We'll dry the tears that we have shed before. Why should we weep who sailed there to fortune? Farewell, England, farewell forever. Cheer, boys, cheer.
After 2 days' march, the Allies settled down to camp for the night. Above the river Alma, a Russian army of 40,000 was waiting for them. Their commander, Prince Menshikov, was so confident of victory that he'd invited Sebastopol's most fashionable set to join him on the heights with champagne, chicken, and opera glasses. They were treated to a spectacle, but not the one they expected. To advance on Sebastopol, the Allied army had to cross the river Alma and ascend the bare hillside under the fire of heavy Russian artillery. It looked impossible, but the Allies had a plan. The crack French troops, the Zouaves, were sent along the coast to scale the cliffs and seize the heights above the Russian army. The attack on both fronts was scheduled to start at dawn. A Zouave called André wrote home about what happened next.
The mist spread a wispy veil over us, which concealed us from the enemy. The humidity of the night had slightly numbed us, but we were full of spirit. Suddenly a messenger arrived to request us to call a halt. The English gentlemen were not yet ready to leave, so we would have to await their pleasure. We were not particularly polite about them, let me tell you.
It was nearly midday before the British were ready. Private Timothy Gowing had to cross the river Alma with cannonballs whistling towards his company.
As soon as the enemy's round shot came hopping along, we simply did the polite. Opened out and allowed them to pass on. There's nothing lost by politeness, even on a battlefield. Presently, they began to pitch their shot and shell right amongst us, and our men began to fall. I felt horribly sick, cold shiver running through my veins.
Down by the sea, the French Zouaves were finally given the order to scale the cliffs.
So voila, we set off boldly, 250 of us, clambering like cats, urging one another on. When our battery emerged upon the plateau, the guns made terrifying breaches in the enemy lines, and you could see whole rows of Russian infantry mowed down by the same cannonball.
On the main battlefield, Private Gowing and the Royal Fusiliers were advancing straight towards the big Russian guns.
We were only about 600 yards from the mouth of the guns. The thunderbolts of war were not far apart, and death loves a crowd. The havoc among the Fusiliers was awful. Still, nothing but death could stop that renowned infantry. We had to fight against tremendous odds. At the top of the hill, our colonel exclaimed when he sounded the assembly, "Where's my poor old Fusiliers? My God, my God." And he cried like a child, wringing his hands.
Despite the harrowing losses, the Fusiliers took the Russian gun position. The gentry on the hill ran for cover, and Prince Menshikov ordered the retreat.
Our army was utterly routed and beaten out of an almost unassailable position. I asked the commander of our battalion where we were going, but even the major didn't know. He had no orders where to go. We all stared at each other and wondered where we should find ourselves. We were like a flock of lost sheep without a shepherd. Captain Khodasevich, Tarutin Regiment.
That evening, William Howard Russell walked across the fields above the River Alma.
One who has not seen cannot conceive the relics of a great fight, especially on such a field as that of the Alma. There was an immense accumulation of camp litter on the hillsides. There was a sickening, sour, fetid smell everywhere, and the grass was sloppy with blood.
The exhausted troops dispersed.
We went into the vineyards and got some grapes. These were the first grapes we'd seen. From there, we went into the village which the enemy had burnt. Here, the surgeons had established a field hospital, several of whom were hard at work amputating limbs. There was a large heap of detached limbs lying in the yard, and many poor fellows waiting their turn. Private Albert Mitchell.
The young soldiers who died at Alma had opened up the road to Sebastopol, but the generals did not take it. They decided to march their army in a different direction, a decision that would lead to hundreds of thousands more deaths on the shores of the Crimea. Inside Sebastopol, the Russian garrison thought it was all over. Then, to their astonishment, they saw the Allied columns marching around the city.
When the Allies marched around from the north to the south, those of us in Sebastopol couldn't believe our eyes. As they moved from their position beneath the northern fortifications, we couldn't understand what they were thinking of. Pyotr Alyabin.
The Allied army had decided to march around Sebastopol and attack it from the south, using the harbour of Balaclava to bring ashore all the equipment needed to mount a proper siege. The man responsible for this disastrous move was Raglan's chief strategist, General Burgoyne. He was 71 years old and argued the only way to take a fortified city was to do it by the book. Bring up the big guns and knock down the fortifications. This would take weeks. Some Allied commanders were horrified by this delay. Looking down on Sebastopol, General Sir George Cathcart could see it was an easy target.
I'm sure I could walk into it with scarcely the loss of a man, at night or an hour before day. We could leave our packs and run into it even in open daylight, only risking a few shots from their gun positions. We see people walking about the streets in great consternation.
In the town, the people were as busy as ants, working day and night at their defenses. In fact, all seemed to be seized with a kind of panic. Admiral Kornilov appeared to have a power of multiplying himself, for he was everywhere, promising large rewards to all if they could only keep the town. Captain Khodasevich, Tarutin Regiment.
The problem facing the Russian naval commanders was not just how to defend Sebastopol from the land, but also how to prevent the Allied fleet attacking from the sea.
The naval commanders were highly intelligent. They quickly saw that they had no role on sea once the French and British navies had arrived. The Allies were overwhelmingly superior. So what they did was to sink some of their ships in a way to block a direct Allied naval assault on Sebastopol, and to land most of the crews. And the crews from the naval units, excellently commanded by the admirals, and with morale very high, formed the backbone of the defence.
The British and French had travelled 2,000 miles to sink the Black Sea Fleet. Now the Russian Navy had done the job themselves. Meanwhile, the Allied army had completed their march around Sebastopol. Just 6 days after storming the heights of Alma, they arrived in Balaclava. From now on, this cramped harbour was the centre of British army activity in the Crimean War. Its name would become synonymous with terrible suffering and extraordinary courage. For the Rifle Brigade, arriving in Balaclava meant a well-earned rest.
I've been sleeping in the open air with my clothes on now for 19 days. Sickness prevails to a great extent, so our company is reduced from 143 to 70. You must tender my kindest love to Sarah and ask her how she would like to see her brother come home with one leg. I fancy I should be a comical fellow. But without joking, I thought I would be shot in 50 places at Alma. It is curious work to be dodging cannonballs all day. I hope I shall be as lucky in the next affair. Your affectionate brother, Harry Blishen.
As the British made their base in Balaclava, the French organised themselves a few miles away in the more spacious harbour at Camiche. Both armies got on with building up their siege operations.
Clearly, the biggest mistake the Allies made in the entire Crimean campaign was to march around Sebastopol and attempt to set up a regular siege. This allowed the Russians to bring in their excellent field engineers and to call up the guns from the naval dockyard. The two armies then set about digging themselves ever deeper into trench systems which look remarkably like the Western Front.
The Allies continued to help the Russians by wasting time. It took them 3 weeks to bring their big guns into position. By the time Fanny Jubilee turned up, the British hadn't yet managed to open fire, but they had attracted the attention of the Russian gunners.
About 1,000 yards from us lay the forts of Sebastopol. The shot and shell came hissing every 2 minutes. We were standing on the brow of a hill, backed by our magnificent troops and fronting the enemy, the doomed city beneath our feet. It was indeed a moment worth 100 years of everyday existence.
The first day of the Allied bombardment was a spectacular affair, but the Russians had used those wasted weeks to very good effect.
From 6 until 9 a.m. they were hard at it. As fast as our men could load and fire, it was ding-dong hard fighting. At 9 a.m, one of the French magazines went up with a crash. As far as we could see, it was all fair give and take. Sergeant Timothy Gowing.
The opening bombardment failed to demolish Sebastopol. Now the initiative swung to the Russians. They decided to counterattack before the Allies could secure their base at Balaclava. Early on the morning of October the 25th, a Russian army of 30,000 descended from the north. Their aim was to cut the line of communication between the siege forces round Sebastopol and the supply base at Balaclava. Fanny Jubilee was asleep on board ship when her husband sent word.
A note was put into my hands from Henry. It ran thus: "The Battle of Balaclava has begun and promises to be a hot one. Lose no time, but come as quickly as you can. Do not wait for breakfast."
Between these woods in the foreground and the hills at the back is the Valley of Death, where the Battle of Balaclava was fought. At dawn, the Russian army launched a surprise attack on Balaclava's first line of defence, Allied gun positions manned by some 900 Turkish soldiers. The Turks held out as long as they could before abandoning their guns and fleeing towards the port. Galloping the other way came Fanny Jubilee, heading for the sound of gunfire.
The road was almost blocked by flying Turks, vociferating, "Ship Johnny," while others came along laden with pots, kettles, arms and plunder. The Russians were by this time in possession of 3 batteries from which the Turks had fled.
What's often forgotten is that those Turks, probably less than 1,000 men, had been holding out for a good 2 hours against immensely superior Russian forces. Men like Lord Raglan, the British commander, Russell, the Times correspondent, arrived on the battlefield only at the end of the Turks' 2-hour resistance. And so the initial impression was one simply of the Turks running away.
Lord Raglan and his staff climbed the hill above the valley to get a better view of the action. They could see the next line of defence guarding the port of Balaclava, the 93rd Highlanders, commanded by Sir Colin Campbell. He formed them up into a thin red line and gave them their orders as an advanced force of Russian cavalry rode towards them.
Men, remember there is no retreat from here. You must die where you stand.
William Howard Russell watched from above, waiting for the Russians to make a move.
The silence is oppressive. Between the cannon bursts, one can hear the champing of bits and the clink of sabres in the valley below. The Russians drew breath for a moment and then in one grand line dashed at the Highlanders. The ground flies beneath their horses' feet. Gathering speed at every stride, they dash on towards that thin red street tipped with a line of steel.
The thin red line had held. The Russian cavalry retreated, and on the hillside, the onlookers cheered the Highlanders. But it was a brief respite. The main force of Russian cavalry was still advancing towards Balaclava. Lord Raglan turned to the Heavy Brigade under the command of General Sir James Scarlett. Scarlett had never been in a battle before in his life. Now he ordered his 300 men to charge uphill straight into 2,000 enemy cavalry. The artist who painted this battle tidied up the scene for the public back home, but William Howard Russell could see it was a vicious struggle.
God help them. They are lost, was the exclamation of more than one man. By sheer steel and sheer courage, Enniskillen and Scott were winning their desperate way right through the enemy's squadrons. Then, with irresistible force, like one bolt from a bow, the rest of the Heavy Brigade rushed at the remnants of the first line of the enemy, went through it as though it were made of pasteboard, and put them to utter rout.
The British had done well to have held off such a large Russian force. The valley was strewn with the casualties of battle, and both sides may have been ready to call it a day. But fate had one more cruel card to play. Lord Raglan could see the Russian army towing away the guns abandoned by the Turks. To lose the guns was tantamount to losing the battle. Someone had to stop them. He sent an order to the Light Brigade, which would send them charging in the wrong direction, towards death and immortality. In October 1854, a British fleet was anchored in the narrow bay at Balaclava harbour on Russia's southern shores. Britain, France and Turkey had invaded the Crimea, intent on destroying the Tsar's Black Sea stronghold at Sebastopol. On October the 25th, a Russian army attacked the British camp just outside Balaclava, trying to push them back into the sea. Early that morning, they forced the Turks to abandon their artillery positions defending the town. From a hilltop just outside Balaclava, the British commander, Lord Raglan, could see the Russians across the valley, dragging away the captured guns. Now, all that could stop them was the cream of the British cavalry, the Light Brigade. The Light Brigade down in the valley couldn't see the Turkish guns behind this hill. The only guns they could see belonged to the main Russian army at the far end of the valley. Cavalryman Albert Mitchell described what happened next.
We could see the enemy had placed a number of guns across the lower part of the valley, nearly a mile and a half from us. At the same time, a field battery ascended a hill on our left front where it was placed in a position facing us. Things were in this state when Captain Nolan came galloping down and handed a paper to Lord Lucan.
Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front. Follow the enemy and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate.
Cavalry Commander Lord Lucan asked for clarification. Nolan replied,
Lord Raglan's orders are that the cavalry should attack immediately.
Attack, sir? Attack what? What guns, sir?
There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns.
The brigade was ordered to advance down the valley towards the main Russian position. Raglan's message had been misunderstood. A 34-year-old Irishman, William Howard Russell, the world's first war correspondent, was watching from the hillside.
They swept proudly past, glittering in the morning sun in all the pride and splendor of war. We could scarcely believe the evidence of our senses. Surely that handful of men are not going to charge an army in position. Alas, it was but too true.
Suddenly, Captain Nolan rode up to Light Brigade Commander Lord Cardigan. Was he trying to redirect the charge? Before he could speak, a shell splinter pierced his chest. Russian guns on both sides of the valley, as well as in the battery ahead, were now pouring a tremendous cannonade on the advancing cavalry. The Allied commanders on the heights could finally see the charge for what it was. Spectacular, but suicidal.
They saw perfectly that at the end of the valley there were Russian guns waiting for them. And they thought that it was completely against all the rules of the military art to charge guns this way. So that's why the General Bosquet had this famous words, c'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre, c'est de la folie.
Madness or not, the Light Brigade was now galloping towards the guns.
As we drew near, the guns in our front supplied us liberally with grape and canister, which brought down men and horses in heaps. Up to this time I was going on all right, but missed my left-hand man from my side, and thinking it might soon be my turn, offered up a short prayer. Oh Lord, protect me, and watch over my poor mother. Private Albert Mitchell.
Galloping behind Mitchell was Butcher Jack Fahey, still wearing his butcher's apron and wielding his axe.
Nearer and nearer we came to the dreadful battery, which kept vomiting death on us like a volcano, till I seemed to feel on me cheek the hot air from the cannon's mouth. At last we were on it. Half a dozen of us leapt in among the guns at once, and I, with one blow of my axe, brained a Russian gunner just as he was clapping the linstock to the touch-hole of his piece.
Having smashed through the line of guns at the end of the valley, the Light Brigade were confronted by massed ranks of Russian cavalry. They charged again, until overwhelming numbers forced them to retreat. Lord Cardigan's dashing second-in-command, Lord George Paget, who had kept a cheroot clenched between his teeth throughout the charge, led his men back through the carnage. The Light Brigade now had to run the gauntlet of Russian cannons again, but relief was at hand. A French cavalry regiment, the Chasseurs d'Afrique, had been waiting for an opportunity to help the retreating Light Brigade. They charged the Russian battery on the hillside, forcing the gunners to withdraw. The brigade struggled back down the valley.
Wounded men and dismounted troopers flying towards us told the sad tale. Demigods could not have done what we had failed to do. At 35 minutes past 11, not a British soldier, except the dead and dying, was left in front of these bloody Muscovite guns. William Howard Russell.
"362 horses were killed. Of some 630 men who charged, 110 were killed in action. "196 were wounded, and 57 taken prisoner. For the rest of the war, the Light Brigade were to be little more than spectators. But the Russians never forgot the British courage at Balaclava, nor risked another encounter with their cavalry. Reports of the battle sent home concentrated on the valor of the Light Brigade. The stupidity of sending cavalry to charge cannons was forgotten. Poets, painters, and the press all rushed to turn disaster into glory. Within weeks, the poet laureate Alfred Lord Tennyson had immortalised the Light Brigade in verse. Tennyson recorded his poem for posterity in 1890.
All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
While Tennyson was writing his poem at home, a Scottish painter and illustrator, William Simpson, had arrived in the Crimea.
The Battle of Balaclava had taken place before I arrived, but it was necessary for me to give pictures. I could easily make sketches on the ground, but I had to trust to those on the spot for a description of the events.
The most important eyewitness Simpson consulted was the Light Brigade commander, Lord Cardigan, but it took several visits to his yacht in Balaclava harbour before the artist's third sketch met with Cardigan's approval.
I went on board a third time and was rewarded with the warmest praise and was able to send it home with the expression of Lord Cardigan's highest admiration. The real truth was that in the last sketch I had taken greater care than in the first two to make his lordship conspicuous in the front of the brigade.
Simpson's vetted watercolours received the same privileged treatment as Raglan's own dispatches from the front and were sent home on the first available ship. Though there was no censorship, William Howard Russell's reports and ordinary soldiers' letters were often delayed in Balaclava to ensure that the official version of events got home first. 2 weeks after Balaclava, the Russians camped on the heights at Inkerman, prepared for another assault on the Allies across the valley. At 4 o'clock in the morning on November the 5th, Pyotr Alabin made a note in his diary.
The rain has made thick mud, which makes our ascent more difficult. The regiments are beginning to move. Our horses are being saddled. We put the samovar on the embers of the fire and drank our fill of tea, perhaps for the last time. The regiments are standing at attention. It's time to close my diary. And will I ever open these precious pages again?
The Russian plan was to steal across the river at dawn and advance up the hill to attack the British batteries, while a continuous barrage from inside Sebastopol distracted the French. Once again, the British were unprepared. Russian guns were devastating the British camp before the Allies even knew what was happening.
The men of the division had just returned off trench duty, and some were preparing breakfast. Others enjoying a short sleep, but were soon aroused by a rough salute from the enemy's guns ploughing up the ground and tearing the tents down about their ears, and the poor fellows, half of them naked under the blankets. Sergeant Richard Barnum, 2nd Division.
The 2nd Division's commander was General Pennyfather, whose rule of thumb in battle was, whenever you see a head, hit it. This was good advice for a battle of skirmishes, fought in thick fog and on ground covered with dense scrub. 28-year-old Captain Henry Clifford was with a group which hurried to Pennyfather's support. In a letter home, he wrote,
Dear friends and relations, at daybreak, fire of musketry was heard to our extreme right. On reaching the ground of the 2nd Division, it was evident from the roll of musketry the enemy was in great force and had driven back our pickets. Most unfortunately, the weather was very foggy, and we could only be guided by the sound of the firing.
Suddenly, Clifford saw a large group of Russians emerging from the fog, only 15 yards away.
It was a moment or two before I could make General Buller believe they were Russians. In God's name, I said, fix bayonets and charge. He gave the order, and in another moment we were hand to hand with them. I drew my sword and cut off one man's arm who was in the act of bayoneting me, and a second, seeing it, turned round and was in the act of running out of my way when I hit him over the back of the neck and laid him dead at my feet. I saw one poor fellow's head carried away by a shot, and some 10 or a dozen blown into the air by a shell.
Elsewhere on the battlefield, things were going better for the Russians. Under cover of their artillery, Captain Hadozievich and his men swiftly overran the British sandbag battery.
Forward with the bayonet, shouted I. I scrambled up the battery and saw by their red coats that we were engaged with the English Guards. They retired about 400 yards and opened a fire of rifles upon us.
20-year-old Sergeant Timothy Gowing of the 7th Fusiliers saw the Russian assault from the sharp end of their bayonets.
Our loss was heavy. 3 generals fell and every mounted officer. But our men fought to the bitter end and stood triumphantly on the rocky ridge cheering for victory. The Guards, all must admit, set a glorious example, for if they had to die, they acted upon the old 57th motto, let us die hard.
British officers on horseback made easy targets, and the high rank of many of the casualties convinced the Russians that victory was at hand. Early that morning, when General Bosquet first heard firing, he had offered French assistance to General Cathcart and Lord George Brown. This had been politely refused. With Cathcart now dead and Brown badly wounded, Bosquet decided to act anyway.
Sweating, our uniforms sticking to our backs with the rain, we chased each other through the bush, and vlam! Someone got hit with the butt of a rifle, and vlam! Someone got a bayonet in the stomach, and someone got a bullet between the eyes. They just kept coming, and we had to continue the massacre. It was kill or be killed. Sergeant Polzak, Regiment of Zouaves.
Finally, the British brought up their own artillery, which together with the French assault proved decisive. The Russians retreated. General Bosquet described the abandoned sandbag battery as an abattoir. The battle had lasted 8 hours, and 10,000 Russians lay dead. The following day, Captain Clifford, who painted these watercolours, came across one of the Russians he had wounded during the battle.
This morning, as I passed the Russians, prisoners and wounded, a man amongst them ran up and called out to me and pointed to his shoulder bound up. It was the poor fellow whose arm I had cut off yesterday. He laughed and said, "Bono Johnny." I took his hand and shook it heartily, and the tears came in my eyes. I had not a shilling in my pocket. Had I had a bag of gold, he should have had it. Our loss has been a sad one, and we are but ill able to stand such victories. Adieu, Henry.
The Allies' victory at Inkerman had taken them no nearer Sebastopol, but had inflicted horrendous casualties on both sides, for which the medical staff and facilities were to prove utterly inadequate. Already thousands had died of disease and on the battlefield. And yet the British had very little in the way of organised medicine for the growing numbers of sick and wounded. The French army had uniformed vivandières, at least one to each regiment. The vivandières looked after the rations and repaired the men's clothes, as well as tending the sick and wounded. The British had no equivalent. Each regiment had been allowed to bring out 6 wives per 100 married men, but such women were neither uniformed, trained, nor paid. Some managed to eke out a living doing laundry, but many ended up needing nursing themselves. Fanny Jubilee, the 24-year-old wife of a well-to-do cavalry officer, was shocked at the British situation.
We have no ambulance wagons. They are nearly all broken down, or the mules are dead, or the drivers are dead or dead drunk, as well one as the other as far as usefulness goes. The French have provided transports for us for some time. Why cannot we tend to our own sick? Why are we so helpless and so broken down?
Worse still, the main British hospital was housed in a filthy barracks at Scutari in Turkey, 3 or 4 days by ship from the Allied base at Balaclava. But one woman in London who had been following the war in the press was determined to do something to help. Florence Nightingale was the 34-year-old manager of a women's hospital in Harley Street, London. She wrote to the government proposing a private expedition to Scutari. She was quickly appointed superintendent of the female nursing establishment of the military hospitals in Turkey, and 38 nurses were selected to accompany her to the barracks hospital. The British medical authorities had given the hospital a clean bill of health. Nightingale was unconvinced.
Barrack Hospital, Scutari, 25th of November. When we came here, there was neither basin, towel, nor soap in the wards, nor any means of personal cleanliness for the wounded, except the following. 30 were to be bathed every night, but this does not do more than include a washing once in 80 days for 2,300 men. The consequences of all this are fever, cholera, gangrene, lice, bugs, fleas, from the using of one sponge in many wounds.
With the funds at her disposal, she bought soap and basins and organised the complete cleaning of the hospital. Every day she paced the miles of corridors, then returned to her room writing letters full of new requests to the authorities at home.
January the 8th, 1855. The fact is that I am now clothing the British Army. The sick were re-embarked at Balaclava for these hospitals without recovering their kits, also half naked besides. And when discharged from here, they carry off, small blame to them, even my knives and forks, shirts, of course, and hospital clothing also. In all our corridors, I think we have not an average of 3 limbs per man. We have 4 miles of beds, and not 18 inches apart. Yet in the midst of this appalling horror, we are steeped up to our necks in blood. There is good. As I went my night rounds among the newly wounded, there was not one murmur, not one groan. The strictest discipline, the most absolute silence and quiet prevailed. Only the step of the sentry. The poor fellows bear pain and mutilation with unshrinking heroism, and die, or are cut up without a complaint.
The myth of Florence Nightingale is this rather serene woman floating down the corridors at night holding the lamp and gazing tenderly at the wounded, which is very far from the real Florence Nightingale. She did in fact walk around the barracks every night in order to see that the soldiers were being well cared for, to see if there were any who wanted to talk, to write letters home. She took a very close interest in them, but she wasn't this ethereal figure. She was a very practical woman. She liked to do some nursing, but that she knew that that was not what her great skill was. She was able to cajole and threaten the orderlies so they kept the place clean in a way it never had been before. She was able to persuade the doctors that they had thought of the changes themselves. She was above all a brilliant administrator.
As cleaning became the nurse's main duty, Welsh nurse Elizabeth Davis was one of several who felt they could be more useful in a strictly medical role nearer the front. Against Florence's wishes, she left Scutari and went to Balaclava.
One soldier there had been wounded at Alma by a shot which passed through his left breast above the heart and came out below the shoulder blade. His wound had not been dressed for 5 weeks, and I took at least a quart of maggots from it. From many other patients, I removed them in handfuls. When the wounds were regularly attended to, these men soon got well. I do not believe that maggots ever occur in cases where the wounds are properly cleansed and dressed. I always consider their presence as proof of neglect.
Interesting enough, at the same time as Florence Nightingale was collecting her nurses in London, in Russia there was a realisation that nothing was being done for the wounded in Sebastopol. So one of the Grand Duchesses set up a group known as the Sisters of Mercy, who were taken to Sebastopol to nurse the wounded there. They arrived after Florence Nightingale had arrived, but they were able to have a more immediate effect probably than Florence Nightingale did, because they were on the spot. They actually went down and looked after the wounded on the battlefield.
Russia's top surgeon, Nikolai Pirogov, was invited to take charge. Like Nightingale, Pirogov was convinced that administration, not medicine, plays the major role in helping the sick and wounded.
I spend from 8 in the morning until 6 at night in the hospital, where the blood flows in rivers. Arriving in Sebastopol 18 days after Inkerman, I found over 2,000 wounded, all lumped together lying on dirty mattresses, soaked with blood. Who do they take these soldiers for? Who will fight well when he is convinced that the wounded will be thrown down like dogs?
Surgical operations were performed simultaneously on 3 operating tables. Pirogov could complete an amputation in 7 minutes, undertaking or supervising some 5,000 operations in 10 months. Russian nurse Yekaterina Bakunina served with Birokov in the Nobles' Assembly, working long hours in the operating rooms. In one letter, she describes a typical night.
Everything in the grand hall was ready. Glasses, vodka, the samovar was boiling. At 11 p.m. we heard the sounds of firing, and immediately the main ceremonial doors were thrown open, and then the words would ring out. This one to Nikolaevsky battery. That meant he was slightly wounded. This one to remain here. That meant there would be an amputation. This one to the Gushin house. That meant there was no hope.
But bullets, bayonets and shells were not the main killers of the war. Having successfully fought off 2 attempts to force them back into the sea, the British felt secure in the natural harbour of Balaclava. But they had reckoned without the weather. On November the 14th, 1854, Fanny Jubilee was on board ship in Balaclava harbour when a hurricane struck.
Ships were crushing and crowding together, all adrift, all breaking and grinding each other to pieces. By 10 o'clock we heard the most frightful rack was going on amongst the ships at anchor, and some of the party started for the rocks. The next tidings were that the Prince, the Resolute and the Rip Van Winkle, the Wanderer, the Progress and a foreign bark had all gone down, and out of the whole, not a dozen people saved.
21 British ships and 14 French ships went down in the storm. Most of the army's warm clothing and medical supplies were lost, just as winter began. Lieutenant Richard Llewellyn of the 46th Foot had arrived in Balaclava aboard the Prince with 600 reinforcements for his regiment only a week before. They were now camped out with 25,000 other British soldiers in their summer tents across the plain above Sebastopol.
November the 15th. Nothing could stand before the full force of the wind. Clothing, pots and kettles and men in pursuit were whirled away. 8 men of my regiment died during the day, and 150 were obliged to go sick. The Prince has been dashed to pieces against the rocks, and her cargo, which included 42,000 greatcoats and large store of winter clothing, medicines and ammunition, entirely lost. The authorities say they would sooner have lost 2 regiments.
In fact, the approaching winter would cost the British far more than 2 regiments. Supplies which weren't sunk in the storm were left rotting in Balaclava harbour, as a combination of impassably muddy roads and chronic inefficiency prevented their delivery to the front. 2 days later, Lieutenant Llewellyn made another note in his journal.
November the 17th. I rode to Balaclava today through a sea of mud in which the British Army waded to and fro, on foot or ponyback, driving Arabas, oxen, mules, dromedaries, engaged in the hopeless task of getting daily food to camp. Here a commissariat wagon had overturned in the mud the day's rations of a regiment. There, a huge gun lay on its side and blocked the way. All the way down, the track was haunted by a string of mules bearing the daily quota of sick men to Scutari, and marked by the bodies of the animals that have died in harness.
Fanny Jubilee watched with alarm as the British base deteriorated.
If anyone should ever wish to erect a model Balaclava in England, I will tell him the ingredients necessary. Take a village of ruined houses in the extremest state of all imaginable dirt, allow the rain to pour in until the place is a swamp of filth ankle deep, catch about 1,000 sick Turks with the plague and cram them into houses indiscriminately. Kill about 100 a day and bury them so as to be scarcely covered with earth, leaving them to rot at leisure. Collect from the water all the offal of the animals slaughtered, together with the occasional floating human body, and stew them all together in a narrow harbour, and you will have a tolerable imitation of the real essence of Balaclava.
As the weather worsened and autumn turned into winter, the British Army found itself bogged down in bureaucracy.
The commissariat, which was in charge of providing food and equipment and clothing for the soldiers, was a branch of the treasury, so that it was always trying to save money. And they had also taken on, as employees, hidebound officials who had no flexibility at all and would allow nothing to be handed out unless they had received forms, often in duplicate, perhaps triplicate. And so it was really curtailed by a series of rules and regulations, which unfortunately the people running it were too unimaginative to think they could break.
With animal fodder among the supplies left to rot in Balaclava harbour, the starving horses were reduced to eating each other's tails. For the men without adequate rations or warm clothing, trench duty was a nightmare in the long hours of sniper fire and occasional shelling.
December the 6th. Today we count 160 dead out of the 600 men of our regiment who landed a month since. The men have been 5 nights out of 7 in the trenches. All the regiment not incapacitated by sickness went into the trenches last night. Returning this morning, they were at once, and without breakfast, sent down to Balaclava on fatigue to carry up bags of biscuits on their backs, whence they are now returning just in time to go into the trenches again tonight. Our men are being worked and starved to death. Their feeble stomachs reject the ration of greasy pork, and we have never got the sugar, rice, or vegetables to which we are entitled. Take with this that the men are usually wet through, that their clothes are torn to pieces, and their wretched government boots soleless, and we have sufficient reason for the death rate. Lieutenant Richard Llewellyn.
Many soldiers simply froze to death in their trenches and were only discovered by the next shift. Others were bayoneted where they had fallen asleep from exhaustion while on duty. Indeed, the Russians believed that winter was their strongest ally. As naval officer Piotr Leslie put it,
"We've got a real Russian winter. There has been such a big snowfall that it comes above the knee, and to add to it there are frosts at night. There hasn't been such a winter in Sebastopol for a long time. We don't know how to thank God for such weather. It is very unpleasant for our enemy. Of those who have surrendered to us, there hasn't been one whose hands or feet haven't been frostbitten. Our soldiers and sailors are just saying, let the Russian winter get its teeth into the English."
standing knee-deep in ice and snow, often for days at a time, was certainly biting its way into what was left of Llewellyn's 600 men.
December the 28th. Our regiment is now reduced. to 60 duty men. Many have been frozen to death and crippled with frostbite.
At Balaclava Hospital, Welsh nurse Elizabeth Davis described the first cases of frostbite she saw in the Crimea.
The toes of both the man's feet fell off with the bandages. The hand of another man fell off at the wrist. It was a fortnight to 6 weeks since the wounds of many of the men had been looked at and dressed.
Of the 3 privates in this picture, William Young on the left was the only one wounded in combat. Henry Burland in the centre suffered frostbite in the trenches. He had his feet amputated at Scutari and his legs at Portsmouth. John Connery on the far right survived the battles of the Alma and Inkerman unscathed, but suffered 3 amputations for frostbite. Many senior officers simply went home for the winter on so-called urgent private affairs. Fanny Jubilee noted in her journal,
Lord George Paget is gone home. 38 other officers, profiting by his example, have sent in their papers.
While such fair-weather soldiers were warming themselves in their London clubs, some of the rank and file were being flogged for cowardice or shot for desertion. Paget, however, found himself snubbed in his club and returned to the Crimea in the spring. But by then, thousands of his fellow soldiers were no longer alive to greet him. Some images of the war that reached London conveyed the misery of conditions in the field, but others were heavily idealised. Captain Frederick Dallas of the 46th Foot indignantly noticed,
"An illustrated newspaper with pictures of us here, only dressed as we ought to be, not as we are. I can assure you that to this date, the 12th of January, we have neither the huts, fur hats, boots, or anything in the picture."
It would be months before such Crimean knitwear as the so-called Balaclava woolen helmet and the cardigan were to arrive in the British camp. The best the men could do was to grow their own head warmers. The Punch cartoon view of the situation ran,
"Well, Jack, here's good news from home. We're going to have a medal."
Well, that's very kind. Maybe one of these days we'll have a coat to stick it on.
As conditions and morale declined, Captain Dallas watched the British commanding officer with contempt.
Lord Raglan rode up on a sleek horse a day or 2 ago, and all he remarked was, "The artillery horses appear insufficiently clad." God forgive him. 2 months ago, he could have got as many ships as he wished and loaded them with wood, with mules from Constantinople, with forage, with in fact every preparation for fighting against winter. But no, nothing was done. He rides rarely through the middle of the camp. The soldiers don't know who he is, and the officers run away to avoid having to salute him.
The winter conditions were nobody's fault, but the commissariat were supposed to provide rations and warm clothing, and had they done so, the effects of the winter would have been very, very much less severe than they were. The responsibility was with the Commissary General, Filder, and behind him, of course, was Raglan, and Raglan must take the ultimate responsibility. There's no doubt in my mind that if the Duke of Wellington had been alive and had been Commander-in-Chief there, then Filder, the Commissary General, would have swung from the gallows.
If Raglan couldn't see the problem, the Times could.
"The noblest army ever sent from these shores has been sacrificed to the grossest mismanagement. Incompetence, lethargy, aristocratic hauteur, official indifference, favour, routine, perverseness and stupidity reign, revel and riot in the camp before Sebastopol, in the harbour of Balaclava, in the hospitals of Scutari, and how much nearer home we do not venture to say."
In London, the failure of aristocratic management in the Crimea was seen as a metaphor for the failure of aristocratic management of government generally, and the Times threw its weight decisively behind a campaign to get rid of the current government. This culminated in January 1855 in a vote of confidence in the House of Commons. The government was so heavily defeated that the result was greeted not with the usual cheers and rattling of papers, but merely nervous laughter.
British officers and men were more critical of their commanders in the field, as Colonel Charles Ash Wyndham wrote to his brother.
I shall be surprised if I see the generals in authority now in the Crimea handed down to posterity as anything but a comfortable, easy-going, gentleman-like set of do-nothings who are only fit to scribble a dispatch to the Secretary of War. If this weather lasts a fortnight, this army is ruined. Absolutely.
Having seen his regiment decimated, Lieutenant Richard Llewellyn himself fell ill, and in March 1855 was shipped home and resigned from the army. Inside the cupboard of the journal he had kept during the campaign, he scribbled one final note.
The destruction of my regiment, which was effected during the months of November, December, January and February, was not owing to any shortcoming on the part of the regiment. It was a case of murder.
By February 1855, as the siege entered its 4th month, the Allied camp had moved 8 miles closer to Sebastopol. The distance from Balaclava simply exacerbated the problem of supplying a camp of 80,000 French troops and 45,000 British. But as the commissariat failed to meet the needs of this huge army, once again, middle-class professionals back home came up with a solution. Florence Nightingale and her nurses had turned the tide of the medical crisis. Now civilian engineers in Britain offered to build a railway from Balaclava to the front line. The Turks provided 200 Montenegrin and Croatian labourers from the far-flung outposts of their Ottoman Empire to prepare the ground. At the beginning of February, they were joined by 500 skilled navvies who arrived from Britain to lay the track. Soon Russell was reporting huge progress.
The navvies are working away heartily, pulling down the rackety houses near the post office at Balaclava so as to form the terminus of the Grand Crimean Central Railway, with branch line to Sebastopol. They have landed a large quantity of barrows, beams, rails, spades, shovels, picks and other materials.
On February the 8th, the navvies started to lay the first rails.
I was astonished to see the progress of the railway. The navvies work famously and do more work in a day than a regiment of English soldiers do in a week. To be sure, the navvies have yet in them the stamina of English living, which has long since been worked out of our poor fellows. Captain Henry Clifford.
On February the 23rd, the first load of commissariat stores was carried from Balaclava to the British camp. A fortnight later, the photographer Roger Fenton arrived in Balaclava. Fenton was the 36-year-old son of an MP and a founder member of the Royal Photographic Society. On reading of the war, he was keen to go and see for himself.
I resolved to go at once to the front and take Sebastopol by photography.
Fenton had photographed the royal family, and this connection eased his introduction to the High Command in the Crimea. It may also have inclined him to a less critical portrait of the war than he had read in the papers.
Everything seems in much better order than the Times led me to expect. There's great activity with the railway workers. Here, a stationary engine is being erected to drag bricks up the hill, where the road is at present steep, and huts are growing up very fast for the timekeeper and workmen.
Among the supplies belatedly arriving in the camp was winter clothing. Fenton persuaded some of the officers to dress up in it for his camera. By the time it arrived, however, it was far too warm to wear. Once again, the commissariat had done too little, too late. The Russians inside Sebastopol were also receiving supplies and reinforcements. One new arrival was a 26-year-old artillery officer, Leo Tolstoy. In a letter to his brother, he wrote,
Dear Sergei, I'll give you an idea of the state of our affairs in Sebastopol. The town is besieged from one side, the south, where we had no fortifications when the enemy approached it. Now we have more than 500 big-caliber guns on this side, and several lines of earthworks, positively impregnable. I spent a week in the fortress, and the last day used to lose my way among these labyrinths of batteries, as though in a forest. The enemy can't get any further. At the slightest advance, he's showered with a hailstorm of missiles.
The siege never succeeded in completely cutting off Sebastopol, and a second Russian army hovered nearby, harassing the Allies and keeping supply lines to the city open. Russian sailors, their ships sunk to blockade the Allied navy, helped man the city's defences. Lieutenant Captain Piotr Leslie looked confidently at the enemy outside the city walls.
We now have 2 Sebastopols, and there isn't much difference between them. The other Sebastopol has even outdone the real Sebastopol. If the newspapers are to be believed, a railway has been built there. But from our heights you can't see it yet. And how marvelous it will be when we drive them away and the railway and wooden huts remain in our hands.
Outside the city, Roger Fenton was equally envious of the Russian defences.
Up to the present time, the Russians have decidedly the best of it. That is the siege, though whenever they attack, they lose heaps of men. Every morning sees some fresh work commenced or finished by the Russians. Sometimes a new rifle pit is finished in the night, sometimes 2 or more are connected together by a trench so as to form a kind of advanced battery.
Often between attacks, a burial truce was arranged, so that the no-man's land which separated the 2 front lines could be cleared of the dead and dying. William Howard Russell described one such occasion in the Times.
The sight was strange beyond description. French, English and Russian officers were walking about saluting each other courteously as they passed, and occasionally entering into conversation, and a constant interchange of little civilities, such as offering and receiving cigar lights, was going on in each little group. But while all this civility was going on, we were walking among the dead, over blood-stained ground covered with evidence of the recent fight, and through the midst of the crowd stalked a solemn procession of soldiers bearing their departed comrades to their long home.
After such brief respites, trench warfare resumed with a vengeance. Captain Hugh Hibbert of the 7th Fusiliers likened the men going down to the trenches to sheep en route for the slaughterhouse.
Not knowing when it will come to one's own turn to receive an ounce of lead for breakfast, or about 6 pounds of iron in the stomach as a cure for the cholera.
Morale among the Allied troops was low. Boredom was setting in, and there was a feeling that anything would be better than this interminable game of cat and mouse.
My dear mother, I do not know when we are to get out of this place or take Sebastopol. I'm heartily sick of the trenches, new batteries, new mortars, and I don't know what else, and the Russians as bad, if not worse than ever. There is no honour or glory to be got in the trenches, where you sit and smoke your pipe and maybe get shot by a sharpshooter. I would 10,000 times sooner fight a couple of decent battles in the field than go shave your head with a mist twice a week and no good done by it, for I say Sebastopol never will be taken until invested. And where are the men to do that? Lieutenant William Young, 29th of March, 1855.
At least the railway ensured there was no shortage of ammunition. On Easter Monday, April the 9th, the Allies began their second bombardment of the besieged city. General Semyarkin of the Russian infantry wrote to his wife that evening.
At 5:05 in the morning, the gentlemen Europeans opened fire along the entire line of Sebastopol's fortifications, and both sides began to ring out with thousands of guns of large caliber.
The photographer, Roger Fenton, went out to watch the bombardment.
The ground here is covered with cannonballs, and I took care to keep well behind the hill in going down, for I could hear the whir, and thus that the balls were coming up the ravine on each side. The 68-pounders especially almost burst the ears, and the shot from them sounded like an express train that had broken off the line and leapt up into the air. The shot and shell did not disturb me so much as the awful clangour, as if all hell had broken loose and the legions of Lucifer were fighting in the air. I could only see the Russian redoubt indistinctly. The mist was so thick and the smoke hung heavily, but it was easy to see that they were not firing one gun to our 4. It must have been uncomfortable in their quarters.
Just 5 days later, Semyarkin wrote another letter.
The situation in Sebastopol remains the same, with ceaseless artillery fire from both sides. It is sad on the heart, but Sebastopol still stands. Everything broken or ruined during the day is repaired overnight, despite the firing, so that by morning it is as though nothing has happened.
Leo Tolstoy was posted to the 4th bastion, the most dangerous of Sebastopol's fortifications. Between shifts, he worked on 3 short stories, the Sebastopol Sketches, which were published during the siege. Despite being fiction, they were to earn the young writer a reputation as a war correspondent to rival Russells.
April the 14th. I'm living in Sebastopol. Our losses already amount to 5,000, but we're holding out not merely well, but in such a way that our defense must clearly prove to the enemy the impossibility of ever taking Sebastopol. In the evening, wrote 2 pages of Sebastopol sketches. Yesterday, a shell exploded near a boy and girl who were playing horses in the street. They put their arms around each other and fell down together.
The war had become a stalemate. Sebastopol had been under siege for 6 months with no end in sight for either side. Tolstoy began writing his second story of the siege, Sebastopol in May.
6 months have now passed since the first cannonball came hurtling over from the bastions of Sebastopol to churn up the earth on the enemy's works. Ever since then, thousands of shells, cannonballs and bullets have been fired from the bastions of the enemy trenches and from those trenches back at the bastions, and the angel of death has hovered ceaselessly above them. But the dispute which the diplomats have failed to settle is proving to be even less amenable to settlement by means of gunpowder and human blood.
Britain and France had been at war with Russia for a year, but the war was to continue for another 12 months. In September 1854, the Allied armies landed at the southern outpost of the Russian Empire in the Crimea. 8 months later, they were still there, camped outside the Russian naval base of Sebastopol. They had laid siege to the city, but had never cut off its main supply routes from the Russian heartland. They were weary and demoralized, and no closer to taking what they had come for, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet.
There is not a man who goes into the trenches who would not give his vote for an assault. For independently of the little value they place on their lives, our men are dead tired of the trench duty and the everlasting doing-nothing state of existence they live in.
Captain Henry Clifford felt the frustration of the men. They were making no progress, and their half-hearted bombardments were getting nowhere. While Sebastopol's supply routes remained open, the Russians had access to men and ammunition. And in fact, for one young officer, life under siege was
the most agreeable time that I've ever had. I go on duty at the bastion for 4 days, and then I'm free for 12 days. I have very elegant accommodation with a piano, looking out onto the boulevard, where there are promenades and music every afternoon. I have a lot of good friends. The weather is superb, and I've begun to bathe in the sea.
Count Leo Tolstoy found Sebastopol life perfect for exercising his literary talent. As the author of Sebastopol Sketches, Leo Tolstoy brought stories of the war into the homes of the educated Russian classes.
The constant charm of danger, and my observations of the soldiers I'm living with, the sailors, and the very methods of war are so pleasant that I don't want to leave here, especially as I would like to be present at the assault, if there is one.
There could be no question of an assault until Sebastopol's defences had been weakened. But the Russians continued to receive supplies and reinforcements from the north, because they still controlled the strategic route across the Sea of Azov.
The Sea of Azov was critical to the Russian position in the Crimea. As the Crimea itself produces very little in the way of food, fodder, or ammunition, the Russians depended on the River Don basin to get their supplies, and the point of contact was across the Sea of Azov in large open boats. Consequently, taking command of the Sea of Azov would have cut off the Russians from their main source of supply. It basically cut their jugular.
In late May, a Russian officer, Schultz, was passing by the Sea of Azov on his way to Sebastopol. He found himself a bystander at a turning point in the war.
As we approached the shore, our eyes were met by a terrifying sight. The entire enemy fleet was anchored on the opposite side in the Straits of Kerch and was pelting the coast with bombs. At the same time, troops were disembarking and forming into columns. They headed off in the direction of the Pavlov battery. As the enemy approached, the entire battery suddenly flew into the air without a single shot being fired.
The Russian garrison had blown up their own arsenal in a panic as the Allied forces made their way up from the shore. What Schultz had witnessed was an Allied naval expedition landing at Kerch.
The beach was strewn with baggage of every description. Horses were splashing through the water to the shore. Men dressed in every kind of garment that was ever worn were walking about, scrambling, swearing, shouting and laughing, a vast deal of the latter.
Roger Fenton, the celebrated Crimean War photographer, had joined the expedition in the spirit of a jaunt. From the other side of the straits, the Russian officer saw what happened next.
Another explosion shook the air to such a degree that even here, the glass in the windows rattled and shattered. This was the powder cellars in Yenikale exploding, the sign that our troops were retreating and the Sea of Azov was in enemy hands.
The Allies had tightened their grip on the Russians. As its main supply route was severed, it could only be a matter of time before Sebastopol would have to surrender. Back at the camp, news of the naval operation's success was joyfully received. Fanny Jubilee, the young wife of an officer with the 8th Hussars, wrote in her journal,
"We hear that the Kerch heroes have brought home lots of plunder, and we are rather curious for their disembarkation. The success attendant on the expedition seems to have put everybody in good spirits, and 'we must have a try for Sebastopol now' is the cry from the general to the newly arrived ensign."
The Allies now set about planning their next move. Sebastopol had two main strongholds, the Malakoff Tower and the Great Redan. The Russians had thrown up two works to protect these key positions, and the Allies now divided their targets to capture them. At long last, Lieutenant William Young of the 49th was to see action.
Well, yesterday about 2 o'clock we heard that 200 of our men were to take the pits in front of the Redan, and so we ordered our dinners as we had to fall in at 4 o'clock.
The pits in front of the Redan were known as the quarries. The British were to attack here. The French were to take the Mamelon there, the works which protected the Malakoff. The attack was set for the 7th of June. It was to be the prelude to the grand assault on Sebastopol itself. The Allied commanders at last felt confident enough to pose for posterity. Roger Fenton, safely back from Kerch, had been rewarded for his patience, as he wrote to his sponsor.
William Agnew, Monday, June the 4th, 1855. I am now at headquarters taking a few portraits I'm yet in want of. Lord Raglan gave me a sitting this morning, and I've obtained a very good likeness of him. General Pelissier, with whom I breakfasted this morning, is coming the day after tomorrow at 5 in the morning. It is impossible to work after 9 or 10 from the intense heat. I should be away if it were not for these great guns, each of whose portrait has to be fairly hunted down.
On the morning of the attack, the great guns posed together. Raglan for the British, Omar Pasha for the Turks, and Pelissier for the French. Later that day, Fenton was drinking claret with Captain Corbett.
Corbett said when we were alone, "Now, Roger, my boy, we could not breakfast with you today, but if we come out all right, Edmund and I will brush you up tomorrow at 6, and you shall take our likenesses.
Corbett was shot through the head and killed outright in the assault. Lieutenant Young survived and finished his letter home 2 days later from his hospital bed.
It was the first time I had ever been under fire without a trench in front of me. From one end of the quarries to the very mamelon was one sheet of fire and a continual racket of musketry. The French were beaten back at first, but then up came their reserves, drums and bugles playing a rub-a-dub-dub you could hear a mile off, and they actually walked through the mamelon. It is a horrid sight when the fight is over. You would not believe, unless you saw it, all the shapes a human being may be made into. I saw fingers and ears, legs, heads and arms all in one great higgledy-piggledy.
This watercolour was painted by Captain Clifford. He sent it to the Illustrated London News.
The above sketch of the interior of the Russian battery, as it appeared on the day after the desperate battle in which it was taken by the French, is from the pencil of an officer who visited the spot during the brief armistice which took place on that day.
The British officer had turned war artist. Clifford's sketch and letter were published in England within a month. The public appetite for news of the war was voracious. The 7th of June had been a good day for the Allies. They had captured 2 important positions, and the field was now open to take Sebastopol itself. Ragland and Pelissier saw an opportunity to seal their new alliance. They would mark the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo by storming Sebastopol. If they could take the Malakoff and the Redan, Sebastopol would fall, and the 18th of June would become a day of celebration on both sides of the Channel. But the significance of the date had not been lost on the Russians. They could not have been more prepared.
We saw large enemy columns advancing on the first and second bastions, but our men did not miss a trick and opened fire with bullets and grape shot, forcing their retreat. More than once we all burst into laughter when a column of French cheerfully advancing suddenly turned around like rabbits and made a run for the ravine. Lieutenant Captain Piotr Leslie.
The 2 armies were meant to attack Sebastopol simultaneously, but the French went in early at the Malakoff, with disastrous results.
When the proposed assault took place, the result was that the French failed at the Malakoff, and by some misunderstanding, our stormers went onto the Redan under the most terrific fire of every description of missile. It was utterly impossible for them to get on, as they were literally mowed down. Captain Fred Dallas, 46th Foot.
But it was no misunderstanding. Raglan knew that the British attack was doomed once the French had been beaten, but it was a point of honour not to break his agreement with Pelissier, and he sent more than 1,000 men to certain death.
Such a fire met us that the whole column seemed to melt away. Still we went on, staggering beneath the terrible hail. Our colonel fell dead, our adjutant the same, and almost every officer we had with us fell dead or wounded. Sergeant Timothy Gowing, 7th Royal Fusiliers.
Our loss is not yet known, but the proportion of officers was immense. Sir John Campbell, who led the stormers, fell one of the first. Poor Colonel Yea of the 7th was killed. Colonel Shadforth was killed, and his regiment, the 57th, suffered awfully, and hosts of others whose names I don't know, and many whom I did and liked. Poor fellows. Captain Fred Dallas, 46th Foot.
Roger Fenton lost many friends that day.
Such is our anniversary of the 18th of June. We reckoned too proudly, and now the 18th of June will be a glorious day to the Russians.
There was no armistice for burying the dead until 4 o'clock the next day. The Russians had waited a cruelly long time to answer the Allies' flag of truce. Captain Henry Clifford of the Rifle Brigade sketched the killing fields.
By 4 o'clock, so bad had been the wounds and so great the heat that the faces of the poor dead could hardly, and many could not, be recognized. Their faces were quite black, and many of them had swollen up and burst. I was obliged to go about amongst the corpses to get the men to carry them away. And I was sick and vomited many times, and the greater number of men who carried the stretchers did the same. I saw, as I thought, a dead rifleman on the ground, partly hid by the grass. I went to the spot. It was the backbone of one, with part of his bowels and a lump or two of flesh with part of his jacket and head by it. All the rest had been blown away by a shell.
Out of 160 of my comrades, 70 were killed and wounded, and I'm sorry to state a number of the sailors were killed. God bless them. They are England's bravest men. Corporal Harry Blishen, Rifle Brigade.
The British Army suffered losses of 1,400 men and nearly 100 officers. Feelings ran high amongst those who were spared.
I consider, and we all consider, the whole of the storming party, out of whom scarcely 200 or 300 got back, were all massacred by the authorities. The Russians, at the armistice for burial of the dead, paid us the compliment of calling us lions commanded by asses. Lieutenant Colonel Strange Jocelyn, Scots Fusilier Guards.
Even before this fatal blunder, Lord Raglan had said that he would be stoned to death in the streets of London, were he ever to return. He was haunted by this final tragic error. Within 10 days, as cholera swept through the camp again, he was dead. The heart had gone out of the campaign, and apart from a few bombardments and sorties, there was little decisive action. Morale was sinking.
I'm quite out of sorts today, as I've had 3 days of diarrhea, and I'm somewhat pulled down in consequence. You can form no idea of the state our camp is in from dust. The wind has been blowing for 3 or 4 days, and everything is smothered. It is impossible to draw. My paints and paper all get spoiled, and then there are thousands and thousands of flies. We've all made up our minds for a second winter in the Crimea, or at any rate all those who see far enough and are determined to see the end of it, if not cut short by cholera or a rifle bullet. Well, this must do for tonight, for I have no news, and my pen and eyes are full of Crimea dust. God bless you all. Adieu, Henry.
Still stuck outside Sebastopol, the Allied armies sweltered in the heat of the Crimea and dreamed of home. The stalemate would be broken far away, not in trenches, nor in cavalry charges, but on the open sea. On a clear morning in June 1855, Tsar Alexander II was looking out of the window at his summer palace on the Baltic Sea, his eyes fixed on an astonishing sight.
The British fleet has approached us and anchored, presumably to wait the arrival of the French vessels.
With the arrival of spring, the Allied Baltic fleet had once again set sail for Russia. The previous year, they had successfully bombarded the Russian naval base at Bobasan. This year, they had returned to take Sveaborg and Kronstadt, the twin strongholds protecting the Russian capital at St. Petersburg. In the heady days after the Russian victory of June the 18th, the Tsar wrote to his commander in the Crimea.
In Kronstadt, where I was a few days ago, everything is ready for their reception. Both land and marine troops are burning with the desire to show themselves worthy of their comrades of Sebastopol.
And they had the guns to do it. Seeing that Kronstadt was impregnable, the Allied fleet turned its attention to Sveaborg. But the Russians were expecting them. They had a new weapon, they had placed almost 1,000 exploding mines in the water. The Allies had to spend days and nights clearing their path in preparation for the bombardment. The Reverend Mr. Hughes, Fellow of Magdalen College, Cambridge, had taken his boat Wee Pet from the Thames Royal Yacht Club and once again sailed up the Gulf of Finland with the Allied fleet. It was excellent spectator sport for war tourists.
About 9 or 10 we saw the gunboats going in and beginning that witch's dance which has been so much admired. And soon after this, as we watched the batteries, a lurid pillar of flame and smoke leaped up into the air and burst abroad like a foul, tawny fountain, casting an unsightly bouquet of huge black fragments far and wide. Soon after dark, a squadron of cutters and launches from the ships, each fitted with a rocket tube, went in and began letting off their fireworks. It was a splendid sight to see the curved flight of the rockets, 5 or 6 sometimes underway together, chasing and crossing each other as they flew.
Sveaborg was a massive boost to Allied morale. It was a major victory at almost no cost. Furthermore, it demonstrated to the Russians that their sea fortresses were exposed to Allied attack. The Allies didn't have the resources to press on to St. Petersburg in 1855, but they did move their fleet up to Kronstadt. They sat at anchor under the Tsar's windows and warned the Russians that they would be back next year.
St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, was threatened on the Baltic. With their victory at Sveaborg, the Allies had struck at the very heart of the Russian Empire. The Tsar's commanders in the Crimea were growing despondent, and their pessimism was infecting the men. Schultz, who had seen the Allies land at Kerch, was now in charge of the second line of defense.
This entire wonderful army of ours watches quite calmly as the enemy, before its very eyes, digs itself deeper and deeper into our land. Cultivating their own vegetable gardens, cutting hay, chopping down forests and grazing cattle. While we pay twice the normal price for forage, we blow up our own batteries and powder stores, destroy our reserves and sink our own ships.
The Allied troops were making themselves at home in the Crimea. By July, provisions were plentiful and the soldiers wanted for little. Much of this good cheer was due to the efforts of one woman, Mary Seacole. The artist William Simpson knew her from his Crimean days.
Mrs. Seacole, an elderly mulatto woman from Jamaica, was a well-known character in the Crimea. All the soldiers and sailors knew her.
At the age of 50, Mary Seacole had travelled from Jamaica to London in the hope of becoming one of Florence Nightingale's nurses. She was not even given an interview. So she paid her own way from London to the Crimea, where she set up in business, selling food and homemade remedies to the troops.
Had you been doing your best to batter Sebastopol about the ears of the Russians in the spring and summer of 1855, the firm of Seacole and Day would have been happy to have served you. And had you been fortunate enough to have visited the British Hotel upon Rice Pudding Day, I warrant you would have ridden back to your hut with kind thoughts of Mother Seacole's endeavours to give you a taste of home.
Mary Seacole provided a comfort, I think it's the only word one can use, which the men really didn't get anywhere else. She could jole the sailors and the soldiers to help her build this British hotel, as she called it, where she served food and she provided her own medicines and really gave them a taste of something civilised, even if it wasn't luxurious, where they felt they were humans again.
Unlike Miss Nightingale and her nurses, who were 3 days' journey away at Scutari, Mrs. Seacole was close at hand. William Howard Russell, the most famous journalist of the Crimean War, championed her courage on the battlefield.
I have seen her go down under fire with her little store of creature comforts for our wounded men, and a more tender or skillful hand about a wound or a broken limb could not be found among our best surgeons. I saw her, at the assault at the Redan, laden not with plunder, good old soul, but with wine, bandages, and food for the wounded or the prisoners.
As the summer wore on, the Allied batteries continued to shell Sebastopol. The success of their operation in the Sea of Azov was finally showing results. They were grinding the Russians down. Lieutenant Captain Pyotr Leslie wrote to his family on the 8th of August.
The saddest thing of all is that to each of our bullets they reply with 10. Our factories cannot produce the quantity of shells that we need in order to do at least some harm to the enemy.
From St. Petersburg, the Tsar looked to his commander in the Crimea to hit back.
Gorchakov doesn't really want a mountain assault. He's convinced that the war is lost in Crimea, actually. He has to attack because he feels that the Tsar insists on it, and because Russia cannot admit defeat in the Crimea without one more major effort.
Prince Gorchakov already sensed defeat, but still he went ahead, with planning the battle of the Chernaya. The Chernaya River marked the boundary between the Russian army and its enemy, and that enemy had been swelled by a contingent of 15,000 Sardinian troops who had arrived in May. The French and Sardinians had taken up a position in the field, occupying the heights beyond the Chernaya. The Russian plan was to cross the river and recapture those heights. They would move at first light on August the 16th. Prince Sviatopolk-Mirsky had only just arrived in Sebastopol. He went out to join his regiment on the eve of battle.
I was amazed by the gloomy disposition of my commander and my new comrades. It was evident that they were prepared to die and had doomed themselves to sacrifice with no hope of success. As night fell, the battalions set off down the road into the valley of the Chernaya. At 9 o'clock, there was an order to stop and rest. Each one lay down where he was.
Over in the French camp, the soldiers were celebrating. It was their emperor's birthday. As dawn broke, the sound of gunfire rang out. Andrei of the 3rd Zouaves jumped to his feet.
It rattled not far from us and echoed resoundingly on our extreme right, in the direction of the Sardinian camp. That night had been very black, not a star had shone in the sky, and it seemed as if day didn't want to break at all, so thick was the mist over the plain. Our commanders didn't quite know what to do with us, since the enemy was invisible.
The Sardinians had been caught off guard.
A burst of shooting surprised us about an hour before dawn. It was the Russians who, having marched and maneuvered for a good part of the night, were starting battle with a furious attack. The combat was short but very lively. We fought with bayonets, with the stocks of our guns, finally even with stones. This was enough to alert those in the camps behind us, and they got into a defensive position in good time. Sub-Lieutenant Ricci, Piedmont Advance Guard.
The early morning mist had cleared, and the Zouaves had time to prepare.
We saw a whole army on the plain. Its right flank was made up of 2 or 3 regiments of Uhlans and Cossacks, waving their forest of lances. Behind this curtain, a whole infantry division was swarming, a big black mass lit up by the glistening of 8,000 to 10,000 bayonets.
Behind those bayonets was Prince Sviatopolk-Mirsky, leading his battalion of Russian infantry.
We drew closer and closer. Suddenly the French halted. The order was heard. They turned and fanned out in a line which immediately opened fire.
The French forced the Russians to retreat. But as soon as the reserves arrived, Gorchakov ordered them to advance back over the bridge.
We bore down on them at an athletic pace, and by God, from that moment on, I couldn't quite say what happened. Just like at Inkerman and at the Mamelon, we had to dig in, advancing and retreating in turns, climbing over wounded and dead bodies, closing our eyes sometimes so as not to see what we were How anyone got out of there safe and sound is impossible to explain. We can only thank God. We managed to push the Russian columns back down to the river, where many unfortunates, tangled up in their long cloaks, drowned.
Henry Clifford, now brevet major, went down to the river with his sketchbook.
The loss of the Russians was even greater than I'd expected. About 1,000 dead bodies lay on and about the bridge. And I do not think General Clare of the Zouaves exaggerated when he said he estimated the enemy's loss of 7,000 killed and wounded.
Mary Seacole went amongst the corpses with her basket of bandages.
On the battlefield, death is fearful indeed. It had come peacefully enough to some. Others it had arrested in the heat of passion. And frozen on their pallid faces, a glare of hatred and defiance that made your warm blood run cold.
In the cool light of day, on the 17th of August, André looked down on the battlefield.
Oh, I once praised the grace of this valley. Now it is covered with corpses, which the nurses are fighting the vultures for, with the birds of prey more active in their voraciousness than the men in their pious work. It must be recognized that glory is dearly won.
On the day after the Battle of the Chernaya, the Allies resumed their bombardment of Sebastopol. Lieutenant Young delighted in their success.
I was looking at some of the buildings the other day through a telescope, and in some of the large ones you might drive a coach and four with ease. The other day we were firing some rockets into the town and we set a house on fire. So the old bloke inside set about removing his furniture, and when he had his 2 carts nicely packed, some of our guns fired a shell slap into them and knocked furniture, carts and all to pot.
For its defenders, Sebastopol was now a trap.
With every hour that passes, it gets harder and harder. Everything has become so loathsome that there's no strength left. And I would be ready to go to Siberia at once, to do hard labor, even for a lifetime, if only it meant I could get out of Sebastopol. Lieutenant Captain Pyotr Leslie.
Prince Gorchakov had thought of a way out. A pontoon bridge had been constructed across the bay from the south to the north side of Sebastopol. Major Clifford was intrigued.
The Russians have finished the bridge, and we are on the tiptoe of expectation to know what is the object of building it. This morning was its first of completion, and thousands have passed from side to side over it. I've even observed through my glass today some of the fair sex honouring it with their little feet. All women, I believe, have small ones. But their presence does not stop the gun from being fired or the shell from bursting, or no doubt the whole of the Russian army would put on petticoats.
The Allies had never blocked off the route north out of Sebastopol. The bridge was to become the Russians' lifeline. They were now ready for the final act. It began with a heavy Allied bombardment. Count Leo Tolstoy wrote in his diary on September the 6th,
I've just been looking at the sky. A wonderful night. Oh God, have mercy upon me. I am a bad man. The stars are in the sky. A bombardment in Sebastopol. Music in the camp. I've done no good. On the contrary, I won some money gambling.
Others were not so cool under fire. Company Commander Yanuary Kobylinski was on the front line of the Russian defense.
Bombs, shot, shells, various kinds of grape shot and bullets poured as though through a sieve. Before noon and in the evening, The firing stopped for 15 or 20 minutes. Everyone was clearing away the rocks, bits of wood and gun carriage strewn all over the place by enemy shells. When suddenly a terrible thunderous boom, and the whole mass of iron was flying our way again.
For the first time in the 349 days of the siege, the Allied bombardment had left the Russians unable to repair the damage. Time had run out. Excited by newspaper reports of the impending fall of Sebastopol, boatloads of tourists had arrived in the Crimea. William Howard Russell, the Times correspondent, described the scene.
All the amateurs and travelling gentlemen who rather abound here just now were in a state of great excitement and dotted the plain in eccentric attire which revived olden memories of cows and yachting and sea bathing.
On the morning of the 8th of September, Fanny Jubilee rode up to join the throng of spectators on the heights above Sebastopol.
We found the cavalry at their usual ungracious work of special constables to prevent amateurs from getting within shot. Now, in the first place, amateurs have no business within range, and in the next place, their heads are their own, and if they like to get them shot off, it is clearly nobody's business but theirs.
Positions were being taken up. Sergeant Timothy Gowing was in the British lines.
As the hour of 12 drew near, all hands were on the alert. We knew well it was death for many of us. Several who had gone through the whole campaign shook hands, saying, "This is hot. Goodbye, old boy. Write to the old folks at home if I do not return," was the request made by many.
The Zouaves would be first in at the Malakoff. For André, the wait seemed an eternity.
Midday finally arrived, and we heard on our right an immense cry of "Vive l'Empereur!" The bugles and drums struck up their own racket. Away they went, racing like hares, the first Zouaves. All that could be seen of them were their huge red pantaloons, which grazed the ground like balls of fire. One by one, 10 by 10, they disappeared behind the overhang of the bastion which flanked the tower.
Within minutes, the French tricolour was flying from the Malakoff tower. The French were in, and the signal for the British to attack followed. Brigadier General Wyndham led the troops to assault.
I went straight at the ditch and did all that man could do to get them into the centre of the battery. But it was no go. I ran out into the middle of the battery with my sword over my head, but it was useless. They would stick to their gabions and to firing, and not come to the bayonet.
The men could not be induced to follow their officers. Many were very young and new to the Crimea. Timothy Gowing, all of 21, was already an old hand. He advanced towards the Redan with one of the new recruits.
It was his first time under fire. He was as pale as death and shaking from head to foot, yet he bravely faced the foe. The poor boy, for he was not much more, requested me not to leave him. He fell dead by my side just outside the Redan. The moss of that field grew red with British blood.
The British beat a humiliating retreat, but to save face, General Simpson ordered a fresh assault for the following morning. He did not know that inside Sebastopol, the Russians had other plans. Prince Gorchakov had decided to evacuate the town. At 6 o'clock that evening, General Semyakin received the order.
I had been instructed to begin the retreat at 6:30 and to finish at 10. When all the troops had left, at a given signal to blow up the bastions, batteries and all the powder cellars. There was no time to think. One had to act.
There was mayhem on the pontoon bridge. Officer Nikolai Berg stood and watched from the other side.
A wave of horses, carts, people flooded over it for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch. Sometimes it seemed to those crossing that the bridge had collapsed and was sinking to the bottom. Crowds shouting and screaming ran back. The crossing was held up. The sky flared with shots, and bomb after bomb burst over those retreating. Then the town burst into flames.
Count Leo Tolstoy was overcome.
I wept when I saw the town in flames and the French flags on our bastions. It was a very sad day.
In the early hours of the 9th of September, the Allied troops were startled by the terrible explosions. Major Clifford jumped onto his horse and rode on and into the Redan.
I looked towards the Malakoff, and there was the French flag, the tricolour, planted on its parapet. Yes, the French had taken the Malakoff, but the English had not taken the Redan. No flag floated on the parapet on which I stood, and if it had, I could have seized it and dashed it into the ditch which we could not pass, or hid it in the bosom of the young officer dead at my feet inside the Redan. I could not stand it long.
One of those lost at the Redan was the young rifleman, Harry Blishen. His naked body was found inside Sebastopol, covered in bayonet wounds. His last letters home had been full of foreboding.
It is for you, dear parents, that I live. And it is a consolation to you, dear parents, that your prayers for me have not been in vain. The Lord's will be done. I know not how soon I may be taken from you.
Fanny Jubilee rode up to the heights overlooking the town.
I could see distinctly the south side in flames. I counted 10 separate fires. It was a magnificent sight, and one which afforded me, in common I fancy with many more, greater satisfaction than pain. I could not think at such a moment of the destruction and desolation of war. I could only remember that the long-coveted prize was ours at last, and I felt no more compunction for town or for Russian than the hound whose lips are red with blood does for the fox which he has chased through a hard run. It was a lawful prize, purchased, God knows, dearly enough, and I felt glad that we had got it.
These photographs were taken straight after Sebastopol had fallen in September 1855. Allied engineers immediately set about destroying the Russian naval dockyards to make sure that the base could never again threaten their supremacy on the sea. Sebastopol had fallen, but the Russians had not surrendered. France had won her victory at the Malakoff, and the French were happy to go home with their hard-earned glory. But the British were still smarting from defeat at the Redan. They wanted nothing less than the elimination of the Russian fleet. But another winter was upon them. Their ships were trapped in the frozen sea. Like the war itself, unable to move in any direction. A defiant Tsar Alexander told his people not to lose heart. Sebastopol is not Moscow, he said. The Crimea is not Russia. But the Allied politicians were moving in for the kill. The British talked up plans for another Baltic expedition, which would take Kronstadt and threaten St. Petersburg itself. Then Austria, the one neutral empire left, threatened to enter the war on another front unless the Russians surrendered. The game was up. In March 1856, this terrible war came to an end. The message that it was all over was sent by telegraph to the regiments in the Crimea. Sergeant Timothy Gowing, who'd been with them from first to last, prepared for home.
I thought of the Alma and my Christian comrade who lay buried beside the river. I thought of the wild charge of our handful of cavalry at Balaclava, of our desperate fight at Inkerman, of our terrible work in the trenches. And after all I'd gone through, death staring me in the face in 1,000 shapes, both in the field and camp, for upwards of 12 long months. Truly, I had much for meditation.
The returning troops were given a hero's welcome. Queen Victoria decreed that all men who'd shown great valour should be awarded a new medal, her personal medal, the Victoria Cross, made from the melted guns which had once guarded Sebastopol. It had been the bloodiest conflict since Waterloo, but the British, with the smallest army, had come off lightest. Only 22,000 had died to destroy Sebastopol.
Britain had won a stunning victory. The power of the Russian state was destroyed for at least a generation. In the interval, Britain had unrivaled access to the resources and lands of the rest of the world. The British set up a global empire. They policed it with Pax Britannica. It was an empire in which the sun never set. At least until 1918, Britain remained unrivaled as a unique global power.
France, with 100,000 dead, had invested much more in the war, and in the short term, they seem to have gained most out of it.
La victoire de Crimée a véritablement remis la France au premier rang.
The victory of the Crimea truly put France back in the first league of European nations. The peace was signed in Paris in March 1856 by the Congress of Paris, at the same time as the Universal Exhibition was being held in Paris. Almost all the sovereigns came, and on this occasion, Napoleon III really did appear to be the new arbiter of Europe. The gains were enormous at the time, but they were squandered within a few years.
The Ottoman Empire, in whose defence the whole war had started, had also lost 100,000 men, probably more. But they had died to save nothing. The empire disintegrated, giving birth to a number of combustible Balkan nation-states whose petty rivalries were to ignite the First World War. The other big loser was the Tsar. Russia had lost 500,000 men and much of its power and influence, but it had learned from defeat.
The main lesson that the Russian government gains from the war is that a backward, pre-industrial state cannot compete, even in military terms, against more modern, industrializing states like Britain and France. Therefore, if Russia is going to survive, it has to have railways, it has to have industry, it has to have an enterprising and educated citizenry. And all of these conceptions really underlie the program of great reforms, which is introduced by the Emperor Alexander II after the war, and whose most famous element is the abolition of serfdom.
"50 years later, Russian survivors of the Crimean War posed in front of one of the first newsreel cameras. Some of them lived to see the Russian Revolution sweep away the Tsars. The world they had fought for disappeared forever. By 1910, when these French soldiers appeared before the camera, they were a last defiant memory of France's only victorious war in the 19th century. Some of these British Crimean veterans would live to see the far greater slaughter of the First World War. They too would see their empire go. Winners and losers, they had all fought in a war which had changed the map of Europe forever.